Have you ever had that prickling sensation on the back of your neck telling you that someone is watching? For one woman in Florida, that feeling turned into a fight for her life when a casual night out ended with a predator at her doorstep. This all went down back in 2017 while I was living in St. Petersburg, Florida. I've always been a homebody, the kind of person who finds a night on the couch much more appealing than a crowded bar. However, my coworker Jenna, who was about 10 years younger than me, was relentless. For weeks, she begged me to go out with her and another friend, Mira. Eventually, I caved. I figured one night of being social wouldn't kill me. The plan was for Jenna to leave her car at my place and for me to drive. This immediately spiked my anxiety. Even though I'd lived in St. Pete for 4 years, I rarely ventured more than a few miles from my neighborhood. Without a GPS, I was essentially blind. After picking up Mira, Jenna navigated us to a packed, high-energy club. We hadn't been inside for more than 10 minutes when Jenna spotted someone she knew. "I'll be right back," she shouted over the music, pulling Mira along with her. I stood there, annoyed and awkward, holding my drink while my friends disappeared into the sea of people. That's when a guy named Jard approached me. He seemed normal enough at first, making basic small talk. I told him I was just waiting for my friends, trying to keep the conversation short. When Jenna and Mira finally returned, we decided to hop to a different bar. Jard followed us to the exit, persistently asking for my number. I gave him a firm no and joined my friends. We hit another spot, but by 2:00 a.m. I was exhausted and ready to call it a night. My friends wanted to keep partying, so I told them to keep my car for the night and I'd just catch an Uber home. My Uber arrived, a quiet, nondescript car with an equally quiet driver. As we pulled away from the neon lights of the strip, I glanced out the back window. A silver sedan was trailing about 2 car lengths behind us. I didn't think much of it until we made a series of complicated turns through residential side streets. The silver car made every single turn we did. When we finally pulled up to my apartment complex, the silver car didn't pass us. It pulled over at the end of the block and cut its lights. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I paid the driver, grabbed my purse, and sprinted toward the heavy glass doors of my building. Just as I pulled the door shut and the lock clicked, I looked back. The door of the silver sedan swung open and a man jumped out, sprinting toward my building. It was Jard, the normal guy from the club. I didn't wait to see if he had a key. I lunged for the elevator, slamming the button for my floor. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached my floor, sprinted to my door, and fumbled with the keys. The second I was inside, I threw every bolt and lock I had. 1 second later, bam. The entire door frame shuddered. Jard was on the other side, throwing his shoulder against the wood and screaming at the top of his lungs. "Open the door, I know you're in there." I collapsed onto the floor, shaking so violently I could barely breathe, and dialed 911. Thankfully, a neighbor heard the commotion and poked his head into the hallway. Seeing a frantic stranger trying to break down a door, the neighbor started yelling and Jard took off. When the police arrived, they took the situation incredibly seriously. Using the name from the credit card he used at the bar and the building's security footage, they identified him as Jard Perez. It turned out he was a serial stalker with a history of following women home. He was eventually charged with stalking and unlawful entry. I never walked home alone again after that night. Even now, years later, I still find myself checking over my shoulder every time I hear footsteps behind me in the dark. I've always been an avid runner. It's my way of decompressing after a long day at work. Usually I stick to a well-lit path near the local park, but on this particular night I stayed late at the office and didn't get home until nearly 11:00 p.m. I knew I should probably just hit the treadmill, but the night air was cool, and I figured a quick 3-mile loop around my neighborhood wouldn't hurt. The streets were dead silent. My neighborhood isn't exactly high crime, but it is poorly lit with long stretches of road between flickering street lamps. I had my headphones in, but the volume was low, a habit I'd developed to stay aware of my surroundings. About a mile into my run, I noticed a dark SUV idling at a 4-way stop. As I ran past it, the driver didn't move. I didn't think much of it until I turned the corner and heard the slow, heavy roll of tires on asphalt behind me. I glanced back. The SUV was crawling along at a snail's pace, keeping a steady 50 feet behind me. I picked up the pace, my heart starting to thud in my chest. I took a sharp left into a narrow alleyway that cars usually avoid. To my horror, the SUV didn't keep going straight. It swung into the alley, its headlights cutting through the darkness like 2 predatory eyes. I was officially panicked. I cut across a neighbor's lawn, jumped a low fence, and sprinted toward a small convenience store that stayed open 24/7. I burst through the doors, gasping for air, and headed straight for the back of the store. The clerk, a teenager who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, barely looked up from his phone. I stayed in the store for nearly 20 minutes pretending to browse the snack aisle while watching the front window. The SUV was parked across the street, just sitting there in the shadows. I knew I couldn't walk home, so I called a friend of mine, Mark, who lived only a few blocks away. I told him I was being followed and needed a ride. Mark arrived 5 minutes later. I scrambled into his car and we did a few check turns to make sure the SUV wasn't following us. It seemed like we'd lost him. When Mark dropped me off at my driveway, he offered to come inside, but I told him I'd be fine. I'd just lock the doors and go straight to bed. I walked into my dark house, locked the front door, and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I stood by the sink, I looked out the small window that faced my backyard. My blood turned to ice. The dark SUV was parked in the alleyway directly behind my house. The driver's side door was open. I dropped the glass, it shattered against the tile, but I didn't move. I stood frozen as I watched a figure step out of the vehicle. He didn't run, he didn't try to hide. He walked slowly to my back fence, leaned against it, and looked directly up at my kitchen window. In the dim moonlight, I could see he was holding something, a camera with a massive lens. I lunged for the phone and called the police, screaming my address into the receiver. By the time the sirens were audible, the SUV was gone. When the police arrived, they found something that terrified me more than the man himself. On the gate of my back fence, tucked into the latch, was a small, printed photograph. It was a picture of me taken through my bedroom window from 3 nights prior. I had been sleeping. The police never caught the driver, and I moved out of that house a month later. I still run, but never at night, and I never ever leave my blinds open. A few years ago, I was working as a bartender at a popular local spot in the city. I actually enjoyed the job, the money was decent, and I liked the fast-paced environment. However, working late nights meant I often didn't leave the building until 3:00 or 4:00 a.m. Because the bar was in a busy area, I usually parked in a multi-story garage about 2 blocks away. About a month into the job, I noticed a man who started coming in every single night I worked. He was middle-aged, always wore a plain gray hoodie, and would sit at the far end of the bar. He never ordered more than 1 beer, and he barely spoke to anyone. But I noticed his eyes, they were always fixed on me. No matter where I moved behind the bar, I could feel his gaze tracking me. I mentioned it to my manager, who shrugged it off. "He's a paying customer and he's not causing trouble," he said, so I tried to ignore it, but then the coincidences started. One night I left work early because of a migraine. As I walked to the parking garage, I saw the gray hoodie duck behind a pillar. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. A few nights later, I stopped at a 24-hour diner for a post-shift meal. 10 minutes after I sat down, he walked in and sat at the booth directly across from mine. He didn't order food, he just stared. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday. I finished my shift at 3:30 a.m. and headed to the garage. The air was thick with fog and the concrete structure felt like a tomb. As I reached the 3rd level where my car was parked, I heard the heavy asterisk clack 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 of boots on the floor below me. I picked up my pace. The boots picked up their pace. I reached my car, fumbled with my keys, and dived inside, locking the doors immediately. Just as I started the engine, a hand slammed against my driver's side window. It was him, the man in the gray hoodie. His face was pressed against the glass, his breath fogging it up. He wasn't screaming or angry, he was smiling, a wide, vacant grin that didn't reach his eyes. He started tapping on the glass with a long, yellowed fingernail. Tap, tap, tap. I threw the car into reverse and floored it. He didn't jump back, he actually tried to grab the door handle as I sped away. I didn't go home, I drove straight to the police station. The police took my statement, but because he hadn't technically assaulted me, they said their options were limited. However, they did send a patrol car to the bar the next night. When the man saw the cruiser out front, he turned around and walked away. He never came back to the bar again. A week later, my manager found something while cleaning out the lost and found bin near where the man used to sit. It was a small, leather-bound notebook. Inside were pages and pages of notes about me. What time I arrived at work, what I wore, what I ate, and most terrifyingly, my home address and the layout of my apartment complex. He had been following me for weeks without me even knowing. I quit that job the next day. I realized that for some people, the chase is a game, and I was never going to wait around to see how that game ended.